the Grand Concord Hall had never gone silent like this before. Ambassador Vos Kelrin of the Threnic Dominion stood frozen mid-sentence, his ceremonial staff trembling in his four-fingered grip, staring at the holographic display that had just replaced his own fleet's proud specifications. Around the circular chamber, 5 other alien delegations sat in various states of stunned silence. The HFY Matriarchy, the Oseran Concord, the Ilvain Trade Compact, the Drevos Ascendancy. All of them staring at a single number that had appeared beneath the newly unveiled human vessel. "That's not possible," whispered Matriarch Soline Vec, of the HFY, her twin sets of eyes narrowing at the display. "No species builds a warship that large without bankrupting their entire economy for a generation." "They didn't build one," said General Praxis Ol of the Oseran Concord, his voice hollow with something that sounded uncomfortably close to fear. "Look at the registry number. They built 12, the room erupted into overlapping voices. Outrage, disbelief, calculation, until a single human voice cut through it all, calm and almost apologetic in tone. "We didn't come here to intimidate anyone," said Fleet Director Amara Osei, standing at the human delegation's podium, without a trace of the triumph the moment seemed to demand. "We came because 5 of you spent the last 2 hours boasting about your battleships as a threat against a species you assumed couldn't compete. We simply thought you deserved an honest picture of what you were threatening, but none of this had begun that way." 6 hours earlier, the Grand Concord Summit had convened for what was supposed to be a routine trade negotiation, the kind of gathering that happened every few years among the 6 spacefaring powers who shared this quadrant of the galaxy, dividing shipping lanes and mining rights with the tedious formality of species who had long ago run out of new territory to conquer without provoking a war none of them wanted. Humanity had only been invited for the first time 11 months ago, after Earth's diplomatic corps successfully brokered a ceasefire between 2 warring factions of the Ilvain Trade Compact. An achievement that had earned humanity a seat at the table, though clearly not yet the galaxy's respect. Amara Osei had expected skepticism. She had not expected what actually happened. It began, innocently enough, with the traditional opening ceremony. Each delegation presenting a summary of their military capabilities, a ritualized display of strength meant to establish the pecking order before serious negotiations began. Ambassador Vos Kelrin went first, unveiling holographic specifications of the Threnic Dominion's newest dreadnought class with obvious pride. "The Ravenscale class," he announced. 8 kilometers of hull, shield capacity unmatched by any power in this quadrant. "We built 3. Matriarch Soline Vec followed, her presentation edged with the particular condescension the HFY reserved for younger species. "The HFY Matriarchy has maintained naval supremacy for 400 years. Our solemn Tide class carries enough firepower to sterilize a planet's surface in under an hour, should the need arise." Nobody knew what the human was hiding, least of all the 5 delegations who had spent the last several presentations subtly, and then not so subtly, directing pointed remarks toward the human delegation. "Of course," General Praxis Ol added, his tone dripping with false politeness, "we understand humanity is still developing its naval capabilities, no shame in that. Every species starts somewhere." Laughter rippled through the chamber, not cruel exactly, but the particular kind of dismissive amusement that older, more established powers, reserved for species they'd already decided, didn't matter. Amara Osei sat through it without visible reaction, her expression carefully neutral, while beside her, Fleet Captain Dominic Reyes clenched his jaw and said nothing. Exactly as they'd rehearsed. Everything changed in the next few seconds, because the 6th and final presentation belonged to the Drevos Ascendancy. A species humanity had, until this summit, had almost no direct contact with, and their ambassador, a sharp-eyed diplomat named Threl Kas, did something none of the other delegations expected. "Before we continue," Kas said, folding his hands with deliberate calm, "I believe it would only be fair to let our newest member present, as well. I understand humanity has spent the last decade quietly developing. Something the rest of us know remarkably little about." Every eye in the chamber turned toward the human delegation. The council had made a terrible mistake. in assuming that silence meant weakness, and they were about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Amara Osei rose slowly, exchanging a brief glance with Dominic Reyes, who gave the faintest nod. This was not the plan. They had come to this summit, intending to negotiate quietly, to avoid exactly this kind of spectacle, to let humanity's actions rather than its arsenal speak for itself. But diplomacy, she had learned in 11 months of dealing with these 6 powers, sometimes required meeting condescension with clarity rather than continued patience. "Very well," she said. "Since you've asked." She activated the podium's display. The truth stunned the entire galaxy, though in this chamber, in this moment, it merely stunned 6 delegations who had, until 60 seconds ago, believed themselves to be the most powerful species in the quadrant. The image that appeared was not a single ship, but a full fleet formation. 12 vessels, each one dwarfing every warship previously specified that day, their hull specifications scrolling beneath in careful, understated text. The Meridian class, 12 kilometers of hull, shield capacity 40% beyond the Kethri's proudest dreadnought. Weapons systems that, notably, Amara did not elaborate on in detail. "We call this ALO the Meridian Initiative," she said calmly. 12 vessels, currently deployed along Earth's outer defense perimeter. We built them not to conquer, and not to threaten anyone in this room, but because 11 months ago, when we first arrived at this summit, exactly one of you. She did not look at anyone in particular, though the entire Oseron delegation stiffened, suggested privately that humanity's absence of a significant fleet made us a convenient testing ground for territorial expansion. Nobody had expected the quiet Chadi species to remember every slight so precisely. General Praxis Ol's expression flickered, just for a moment, betraying recognition of a private conversation he'd assumed had gone unheard. "We didn't respond to that suggestion with outrage," Amara continued. "We responded by building enough deterrent that the suggestion would never be made again. By anyone. That's the difference, I think, between how our species approaches strength. You display it to establish dominance. We built ours quietly, and we would have been perfectly content never showing it to anyone, if boasting about battleships as a threat hadn't become the theme of today's proceedings."
The silence that followed was absolute.
That wasn't even the biggest surprise, because Threl Kas, the Drevos ambassador, who had invited humanity's presentation in the first place, rose from his seat with an expression that, to the surprise of every other delegation, looked almost pleased. "I suspected as much," he said quietly. "May I ask a question, Director Osei? 12 vessels, deployed defensively, publicly unrevealed for nearly a year. That's not the behavior of a species preparing for conquest. That's the behavior of a species preparing to survive one." Amara met his gaze steadily. "Yes. Then may I ask what convinced you to reveal them today, rather than continuing to keep them hidden?" The princess had overlooked one crucial detail. For though no one in the chamber yet knew it, Threl Kas was not merely an ambassador, but the exiled heir to the Drevos Ascendancy's throne, driven from his homeworld years earlier by a military coup that had installed a far more aggressive government in his place. He understood, more than anyone else present, precisely what it meant for a species to build strength not from ambition, but from necessity. Because pretending weakness stopped being useful the moment it became an invitation for threats, Amara said. "We didn't want a war, we still don't. But we've learned, in our brief history among the stars, that peace negotiated from a position of perceived helplessness rarely holds. We'd rather negotiate honestly, as equals, than continue this summit under false pretenses." The queen suddenly froze. For matriarch Soline Vec, who had spent 4 centuries watching younger species rise, and inevitably, either submit to Kethri dominance or be quietly eliminated, as threats, found herself facing something entirely outside her 400 years of political experience. A species that had chosen strength not as a prelude to conquest, but as a foundation for genuine parity. "This changes the entire framework of these negotiations," she said slowly. "Yes," Amara agreed. "I imagine it does." What followed was not the triumphant celebration a lesser diplomat might have expected, nor the outraged confrontation the more aggressive delegations seemed braced for. Instead, something far more interesting happened. A recalibration, visible in real time, as 5 ancient powers quietly reassessed a species they had spent 11 months treating as an afterthought. General Praxisol was the first to break the silence. His earlier condescension, gone entirely. 12 vessels of that specification would have taken the Grand Concord the better part of 2 decades to construct, even at maximum shipyard capacity. How did you manage it in under 10 years? Amara allowed herself, for the first time that day, a small and genuine smile. We've spent the last century fighting among ourselves over considerably smaller things than territory or conquest. It turns out a species that has survived its own worst instincts develops rather efficient shipbuilding techniques out of necessity. We simply redirected that efficiency outward. Once we realized we weren't alone in the galaxy, a difficult decision settled over the chamber as the 6 delegations, for the first time in the summit's history, found themselves negotiating not from assumed hierarchy, but from something closer to mutual uncertainty, an uncertainty that, remarkably, several of them seemed to find more honest than the theater that had preceded it. Ambassador Vos Kelrin, whose earlier boast about the Threnic Dominion's dreadnoughts now felt considerably smaller in retrospect, cleared his throat. For what it's worth. Director Osei. The Dominion had no intention of acting on Ol's earlier suggestion, we prefer trade to war. It's simply more profitable. Noted, Amara said, and appreciated. Fleet Captain Dominic Reyes leaned toward her as the chamber began to stir with quiet, urgent conversation among the other delegations. You realize half of them are going to spend the next week trying to figure out if we actually have 12 ships, or if that display was a bluff, he murmured. They are, Amara agreed. And they'll send scouts, quietly, to verify. Let them. The Meridian Initiative isn't a secret we need to protect anymore, it's a fact we need them to trust. She glanced at him. The moment we start hiding details again, we're back to negotiating from fear instead of honesty. I'd rather they see exactly what we have and choose peace anyway, than wonder forever what we might be concealing. Dominic considered that, then nodded slowly. 11 months ago I'd have said that was reckless. And now I think it's the only thing that's worked all day. The negotiations that followed, stretched late into the summit's final session, reshaped entirely by the morning's revelation. Trade agreements once weighted heavily in favor of the 5 established powers were renegotiated with genuine consideration for human interests. Shipping lane disputes that had, an hour earlier, seemed destined for humanity's disadvantage, found unexpectedly fair resolution. Not because anyone in that chamber had grown to like humanity. Trust, Amara understood, would take considerably longer than a single afternoon. But because respect, once earned through honest strength rather than empty threat, proved far more durable than the fragile hierarchy that had Sadzard summit that morning. The truth the galaxy eventually settled on was not the exaggerated legend that would later spread through 6 star systems. The story of humanity's secret armada grew taller with each retelling, as such stories always did, but something quieter and more meaningful. That respect, among species capable of genuine violence, was rarely given freely. It had to be built, patiently and honestly, the same way Earth had built 12 warships not from ambition, but from the hard-earned understanding that peace without capability was simply an invitation for someone, eventually, to test it. As the summit closed and delegates filed out into the star-strung night beyond the Concord Hall's viewports, Threl Kas paused beside Amara Osei, his exiled prince's eyes carrying the weight of a man who understood loss and survival in equal measure. For what it's worth, Director, he said quietly. The Dravos Ascendancy would very much like to speak further with your people, not as a threat assessment, as potential friends. Amara extended her hand, a human gesture the Dravos had only recently learned to reciprocate, and shook his firmly. We'd like that too, she said. Humanity's not looking to be the strongest fleet in this quadrant, General Kas. We're looking to make sure that when the day comes we finally get to put these ships away for good, we'll have earned the peace that lets us do it. Behind her, framed against the endless dark beyond the viewport, 12 silent shapes held their quiet vigil at the edge of human space. Not as a threat to a galaxy that had underestimated them, but as a promise to a species that had learned, the hard way, that peace worth keeping was always worth defending.